Welcome back to the Buddy Ruski Show. This is episode 7. We've been on a little bit of a hiatus as I transition into a new job. So thank you for being patient and sticking with us. We are going to switch up the recording cadence a little bit moving forward. This still is a one-man band, so the time it takes to record the show, to prep for the show, edit the show, publish the show, all that good stuff that goes into this great project that we have here. I want to continue to give the quality that you've seen from this show and just my work in general. So with that, to be able to do that, we may switch to a bi-weekly schedule as opposed to the weekly schedule that we've been on, or at least that we were on for some time. Also, if you haven't already, definitely go check out the American Underground page on Twitter, on Instagram. I'm pretty excited to be working with them as the marketer in residence and having an opportunity to really, have the chance to speak to the tech scene here in a different way and give voice not only to the companies and the brands that are in the space, but also to shed some light on the people behind the companies and have the community here really understand the types of people that are moving to Durham, what they bring to this community. I and my guest today have both been skeptics of some of the change that's happening in Durham and in the community at large. And over time, I still carry that same skepticism, but I've tried to have a more open mind about what this community can be. We, especially folks who are, self-identifying progressives, like to think that America is a place that people of all walks of life can come and participate in, whether they're, fleeing turmoil in their own countries or just see this country that we love as a place of opportunity and a place with rich culture and diversity, and they want to get plugged into that. And so I try to keep that same mentality as a citizen of Durham, a longtime citizen of Durham, and someone that believes in power in numbers and community and learning from one another. And so with all that to say, there's some really, really interesting people and things being built in the American Underground. And I hope in my new position there that I can shed some light on all that activity. So if you appreciate any of the work that I have done or that I still do, whether it be through this show, through my website, through the Clarion content, through Runaway, please go and follow American Underground, their Twitter, Instagram. Check out the website as well. Come by for a tour. I'd love to show you around the community that I get to spend so much time with. I'd really appreciate that. And with that, we're going to get into episode 7. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Buddy Ruski Show. This is episode 7, and I'm very excited to be here with my special guest, Aaron Mandel. Aaron is the editor-in-chief and founder of Clarion Content, which many of you know I have done numerous projects with, written things, done podcasts. We have the Town Hall show now with Steve Schul. So really excited to talk to Aaron about why he started Clarion Content, sort of the journey behind his life as a journalist, but then also some big picture stuff about Durham and what brought him here and kind of what he sees for the future. But without further ado, Aaron, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Justin. I'm super excited to have you interviewing me.
I know it's weird that I had Katie DeCanto on the last episode, and we realized that I don't think I have ever interviewed her for anything, and I feel like I've known her about as long as I've known you, and it's strange that I would say neither one of us really has been in this position where we're interviewing the other person. So this is another long overdue conversation, I think, and I'm really excited to have it.
Same here.
Yeah, I'd love to start just with your background. I know you're not a Durham native. We've talked a little bit about sort of your journey to Durham, but I'd love for you to share with the audience sort of your background, your upbringing, and then how you got to Durham.
Rock and roll. Happy to do it. And really, thanks, Matt, for having me on. I'm stoked. My background, I grew up in Jersey. I tell people now that Durham is my home, but I'm definitely from Jersey. And I think in some ways that was what attracted me to Durham. I would almost say, I often anecdotally say that when I moved here, I could end up in Chapel Hill, Raleigh, Cary. I didn't really know the area. I moved here with a woman who was going to grad school all the way back in 1997, the summer of 97, if you can believe that.
Good year.
And we didn't know where we were going to live. We just knew that she was going to law school here. And Durham ended up being where I live. And I feel like some of that is those parallels with New Jersey. I mean, part of it was an era when you rented stuff by fax and phone across the country. Chapel Hill was far too snooty to have us. Maybe Cary wasn't even blown up in 1997. I don't know. But Durham, we could definitely rent by phone and fax. They were just like, send us the check. Great, we'll take it. And we didn't know about Durham's quote unquote scary reputation. But over the years, I felt like this Durham Jersey parallel of like, Manhattan and Connecticut look down on Jersey. Long Island looks down on Jersey. It's the same way like Cary, Raleigh, all these other places look down on Durham and call us unsafe, call us dirty. And I think it's rooted in the same stereotypes, which is to say we're a place of color, and we're a place where what happens in communities of color is often, where it's the factories are put or the dump is put or the power lines are more visible. But to me, also what it had in common with Jersey is that people don't front. There's far less putting on airs in the Durham that I experienced than, the way they used to joke about the wine and cheesers and maybe still do it North Carolina basketball games. I know this is a pro Duke show, so
speak freely about the wine and cheesers at the Carolina games.
So we heard of that sort of reputation about Chapel Hill, and Raleigh was the state capital, and Cary was the containment area for relocated Yankees, and Durham really felt like organically more our kind of place. So we really only had signed a 1-year lease. She had 3 years of law school. And we did not end up together. It didn't even really last through her first year of law school. But Durham did last for me. I moved from one apartment in Durham to another apartment in Durham in 1999, I ended up buying a house in Durham, which, I could have bought a building downtown. Who knew? If I knew it was going to happen then, now perhaps I buy, a whole building downtown for the same price I bought my house. But it was still a great time and a great decision and a place that I felt like I really related to.
And you, did you go through the public schools in Jersey, kind of come up through the...
In Jersey, I went through the public schools, although people who know me really well know that my story is actually even longer than Jersey. My dad was first in the Air Force and then worked for American Airlines. So I moved 5 times before I got to Jersey, which very much shaped who I am as a person. I was born in in Denver, Colorado area, moved to Half Moon Bay, California, outside San Francisco, moved to Chicago in first grade.
And these are all military bases that you were on?
It was American Airlines by that point.
Okay.
Dallas in 3rd grade, then off to Jersey in the middle of 4th grade. So it was tough because you kept losing your friends and you got a little upset about that. But on the other hand, I felt like I could talk to anybody. I knew places all over the country. One of the benefits of working for the airlines back then, and I think still, is that you can fly standby. So when I was a little kid, I was like flying to places for free. Like when I lived in California, I was like 6, and my parents would put me on the plane in that era by myself. Stewardesses take care of you. You'd fly to Newark, New Jersey, and I'd see my grandmother in Jersey. And similarly, flying across country from O'Hare Airport in Chicago, and just having lots and lots of transition when I was young. So I did go to the public schools in Jersey, but I also went to public schools in Texas, Chicago, and California before that.
So you had family in New Jersey this whole time. The relocation eventually to New Jersey was not by chance.
It was by chance insofar as American Airlines. My dad worked for Sky Chefs, which was their people who do the catering for American Airlines, a subsidiary. So he was assigned to manage the LaGuardia Airport flight kitchen. But my grandmother did live in Jersey on my dad's side, and my dad grew up in Jersey. My mother grew up in Philly. But I'm East Coast far more than I'm Southern. I got cousins in North Jersey. I got cousins in the Philadelphia area still. I got cousins in upstate New York and people who've retired to Florida as well. However, I have taken some of that accent and attitude out of my voice. I did keep the don't front psychology of like that Durham and Jersey both have, where no BS. We can curse on this, yeah? I would imagine.
Yeah.
Where no bullshit is the way to roll. Like, it's just far easier to remember your story if you tell the truth rather than create a fictional sense of yourself. So I did keep that Jersey attitude. I was very confused, actually, when I first met someone who was demure in the South. It's not a characteristic I understood. And I think, all of you out there who I've had to apologize to for my Jersey behavior, I just like to apologize again and say, I mean what I say most of the time. I'm trying to be as honest as I can, and I'm sorry if it's offensive, but I hope the truth will set us all free.
Well, and you talked earlier about, in your experience flying around that you ended up talking to a lot of people and became very comfortable with communication. And I imagine that, lent itself well as you journeyed into a life as a journalist and as a writer. So talk to me a little bit about that sort of transition, or how you came to sort of become inspired by writing and sort of your work with Clarion Content. Did you have a newspaper at your high school that you worked on? Was there any sort of publications either in New Jersey or when you moved to Durham that sort of hooked you?
So the irony is, I was not a journalism major at Indiana, I went to Indiana University in Bloomington, and they have a great journalism school. I had no idea I wanted to be a journalist at that point. I was actually a college debater, a policy debater, and I majored in history and religious studies.
I would have never guessed.
Right, yeah. I do run my mouth. It's not just Jersey to blame for my running my mouth. I'd like to thank the Indiana College debate team as well. So I didn't know I was going to be a journalist. I always knew I wanted to be a writer. Even when I was a very young person, I was writing fiction as early as 3rd and 4th grade, writing short stories, trying to write novels. But I didn't work for the high school paper. I didn't work for the college paper. I just was a very social and interested person. I loved storytelling, period. I enjoy it now in journalism from the interviewing angle. Like, I love talking, over the years, I've talked with so many interesting people in Durham, and I love just digging into their story and who they are and what motivates them and why it works and what didn't work and what have they done and what is their background. But that originally comes from me out of a love of creating fictional characters and wanting to know people. So,
were there any particular stories that you read or movies that you watched growing up that inspired this interest in people or in characters?
That's a great question. I mean, there are so many books. It's very hard to go back and say what's foundational books for oneself. I would certainly say E.B. White and Charlotte's Web was incredibly important to me. And part of what's interesting with that is they were trying to save Wilbur the pig with words. They were putting words in the web, and it was empowering, both in that it was a really cool spiritual story, and I love the way the animals and Charlotte get along, and that still has great meaning to me about how we might get along with our environment and the earth and other creatures. But also, I think as a little kid, even if I didn't catch all of that nuance, maybe I just felt it organically, I knew they were saving him with words. And that seemed really powerful to me, a really cool idea, and that stories were important. And if we created a cool enough story around Wilbur the pig, who could possibly kill him, right? And I hadn't even seen, the whole, Pulp Fiction about the dog and the pig and the bacon
Oh, sure.
yeah, right. So I think that was certainly one of the stories that was inspirational to me as a young person. And the founding of the Clarion Content really came out of a different place. Like when I first got to Durham, my very first job, I worked at the Macaroni Grill, which was still a thing way back then as a waiter. But one of the people at the Macaroni Grill who was a bartender also worked at Foster's Market, my friend Meg DeLuca, who was their catering manager for many years. And she convinced me to come work at Foster's Market. I was their bookkeeper and accountant. And Foster's Market, in so many ways, is the root of tons and tons of my Durham friendships. My coworkers from that period, the people I met who were customers. I love Sarah Foster and the community she curated, and what it said about Durham, that it had this kind of place like Foster's, even when Foster's was in an area that was isolated. Gugelhof wasn't even there when I worked at Foster's.
So you don't have a journalism background academically, but your curiosity in stories and in people kind of leads you down this path towards exploring that more.
Yeah, and it connects to the Clarion Content at the point at which I'm already a writer. I love writing. I'm writing all the time this fiction. I know lots of people in Durham. My friend Mary Kaufman from Foster's got me to be roommates with her brother, Mark Kaufman, a tremendous painter who, if you can ever see his work, I highly recommend it. There is a little bit of it on the Clarion Content in the back files, but Mark told me at one point, I was writing the Clarion Content almost as a rant space. Like, I've always believed as a fiction writer that you need other spaces besides your fiction to write, or your fiction becomes kind of whiny and bitchy and autobiographical in a way that I find very irritating. I think a lot of people find irritating. So I needed a rant space, and I had a blogger. And that's what the Clarion Content was at first. I was bitching about politics. I was complaining about the Yankees and the Knicks. I was excited about Obama being elected. It was me writing about national stories with no one else connected. And my friend Mark Kaufman, the painter, who I know through Mary, who goes back to Foster, said to me, well, all of these folks. We know all of these folks who are artists and writers and creators. Why don't you write about Durham? And it was like a revelation. I was like, I could write about Durham? I had no idea. And we did know lots of people. Ned Phillips was part of our circle. The fabulous documentarian, is working with Bradley Bethel and Victoria Bouillabaisse these days. And J-Law and Eli, who founded Lilo, were part of our circle. And Hammer No More the Fingers and, Duncan. And it was very organic the way the Clarion Content started. I think I went to like the third exhibit at the Carrick when it was on Parish Street, and it was my friend Catherine Howard doing these beautiful shrouds with the Center for Eating Disorders. And I was like, what is this place? I can write about this. And so many of the early Clarion Content stories were like that. It was just people who someone had recommended to us. We vaguely knew. I was going to the Dirty Durham meetings during that era. So Patrick Phelps McEwen was part of my circle. And people would say, well, you got to go to the Party Illegal, or you got to see this show, or you got to hear about this thing. And Dirty did a lot of visual art too in the beginning. So Julia Gartrell created a whole house one time out by Golden Belt, back before Golden Belt was much of a thing, that was like an exhibit. And, so I would go to these things and I would get to write about them. And in so many ways, it felt like writing about people who were already part of my world. And it was very exciting to me to discover that was okay.
Yeah, and that there was an audience for it. I mean, I imagine, what year did you start Clarion Content officially, or if you could ballpark it?
The blogger probably started 12 years ago now, and I would say it's more like 2010, second half of 2010, 2011, when we started writing articles about places in Durham and things that were happening in Durham, stuff like the Carrick, and then, what was going on in the Durham Arts Council. We had a metafiction story that Katie Childs wrote that was called Searching for Ringside, because the legendary Ringside bar downtown had disappeared by that point.
And did your inclination to start Clarion Content come at all from a place where you felt like the media institutions, the newspapers that already existed, the Herald Suns, the NNOs, the Indies, were not capturing some of this stuff that you were seeing at places like the Carrick, or some of these art shows through Dirty Durham, was there a void that you felt like the Clarion content was filling with those stories?
Definitely. I mean, I don't want to sound arrogant, but definitely. And anyone who's here knows the truth of what the Herald Sun looked like then and what it looks like now, or what the NNO was doing in terms of devoting coverage to Durham then and now. I mean, it was only the police blotter. I don't think that there was a Herald Sun reporter in the Carrick in the first couple of years, for sure, let alone who had any idea what was happening at the Pinhook or, in Dirty Durham meetings or that Runaway, you're a Runaway veteran. We interviewed Gabe as he was founding Runaway. Like, Runaway had no physical space. He was just making the transition from this terrific illustration and work he had done at Syracuse and these shows he was doing in New York to, like, I need to found some other kind of company. Maybe I'll sell t-shirts and fashion items because my friends can't afford these $1,000 paintings, and we were on the ground in a way that was organic. It wasn't like we were like, man, the Herald Sun is doing a shitty job. We were like, wow, look at what our friends and these terrific creators are doing in Durham. Someone has to shout about that. Someone has to cover it. I wish I had the entrepreneurial experience, then that I've seen happen now. There wasn't American Underground. It wasn't a thing. And nobody coached me about how it might make money or even how to think about how it should make money. So I sort of missed that part of the equation, but the story part was great.
And it's tough. I mean, I imagine that for a lot of people that start media projects, that it doesn't come from a place of wanting to make money. There's a story that they want to tell, and that is the driving force behind it. And it's for it to survive, obviously, it has to there has to be revenue that comes in that you can pay staffers. And even with the increased technology available to do things, through social, everybody has a iPhone now or a smartphone where you can take the photo, blog, do everything from that device. It's still, there still has to be resources put into it for it to be robust. But I think that's a place that you and I, when I first met and we were talking about sort of the early blog posts that I was doing, where we really aligned, is that we found ourselves in these circles where it's like, wow, all of our friends do all this cool shit. Why aren't people talking about it? And I think around the time that I first started writing and approached you about wanting to blog for Clarion Content, I had actually moved in with John and Eli from Lila, and that was
you were living in the Anderson Street house, right?
And that was a time where I felt like really was the, and obviously my history in Durham limits my ability to understand the full scope of everything that's happened in downtown. And there are folks, a generation above me that'll talk about places like Ringside that I don't have a perspective on. But I do really feel like that 2010 era with Dirty Durham and Party Illegal, with Lila and Hammer and The Beast and Runaway and early Pinhook and the genesis of Motorco,
exactly,
and a lot
Full
of this
Steam
stuff,
being founded, and Shed Letter Press. I think you could go through and look, Parker and Otis's founding kind of dates to that era. I think you're absolutely right that the cultural momentum was amazing. And when somebody, maybe me, maybe you, maybe somebody else, writes the book of how Durham parallels Austin, Seattle, Brooklyn, I think those are some of the cultural prime movers we'll be talking about.
Yeah, from the little, and there's a book out now, I think it came out a couple years ago, on the Rolling Stone, and I listened to a podcast a few months ago with one of the early editors about the Rolling Stone, and sort of it coming from a similar place of like, wow, I'm in this environment and all this crazy stuff is happening with, like war protests and rock and roll and all this collision of culture, and no one seems to be aware of what's happening. And granted, this was in the, 60s and 70s. It's the media landscape and was very different than, no internet, sort of like mass media didn't really exist in the way it does now. But it does parallel in that there was this void. There wasn't a voice being given to this really important culture that ultimately, in my biased opinion, really shaped Durham into what it is now.
Definitely.
Obviously, there are things like DPAC and American Tobacco Campus and other, larger developments that
Sure,
sort of
but think
helped
like
do
what
that.
the
But
art of cool was like at the beginning. We interviewed Cicely like right before the first Art of
Right.
Cool, you and I. And, I sat in the first Art of Cool focus group meeting. We covered the first Durham Hip Hop Summit, We talked to Tune and Law in that era. We talked to De Facto Thespian. And like these people were the culture makers that made Durham cool. There was obviously we all know there was a point when no one lived in downtown, but it wasn't just no one lived in downtown. People shit on Durham culture repeatedly and said there was no Durham culture. And that is, patently unfair to Hayti and things that Dasanahanu was already doing, and unfair to the Hillside Marching Band, and unfair to the Bimbe Festival. And we've had great culture for a long time. But there was also a point where downtown was so dead, they moved Centerfest into a parking lot and stopped blocking off downtown. And you and I and Eli McDuffie and Jeremy Rist were part of the people who went to Sherry DeVries and Margaret Dumont and the Durham Arts Council people and said, this is ridiculous. Why don't you book the really good bands and the great culture we have around here and blow this the hell back up? You see what's going on with the Carrick and the Pleiades and these places? And, they had a year of focus groups and then they moved it back into downtown. And it's far, far too arrogant to think that, we deserve credit for that. We were just part of the conversation of people who were like, look at all this great culture around us. Look what, Queen Please is doing. Look what Arielle is doing at Coco, and, Leon are doing with Coco Cinnamon. I mean, Daisy Cakes was a thing in that era. I remember sitting with the Pie Pushers, Mike and Becky, in their first, early financial meetings when they were conceiving of the truck and getting the trailer done in Alabama. And I think, it was just incredibly inspirational to be around all these people. And I think there's really something, too, to the way we inspired each other. We would look around the room and be like, damn, look at what that person's doing. Damn, Kim's opening the Pinhook. That's so brave. Wasn't she just a bartender like weeks ago? How did, and so much of that vibe. I mean, I remember when the Federal opened.
Yeah. That, I think the Federal, James Joyce, sort of that block of Brightleaf Square is like right before my sort of time in downtown Durham. There are people that speak very fondly of the Federal specifically, that I think are a generation right above me, where the Federal was the sort of hub for a lot of people. And
Definitely.
you see folks like, Jay Kuchma and Charlotte. And man, I haven't yet found a character in Durham that can replace what Jay Kuchma meant to this community. I don't know if he listens to this show, but if somebody is listening that can, I guess I could send it to Jay myself, but he was somebody talking about inspiration very early on, when Tommy finally moved in with us over at the Anderson house, and he was playing with Jay, and they would have rehearsals at the house. And that for me,
those rehearsals, man, like how lucky are you to get to sit there and hear those rehearsals?
Yeah. Well, and the same thing for Lila as well. That living in that house, I think really is what inspired me to take that next level as a writer, to your point about being inspired and being around cool people and getting to see the behind the scenes and,
see how hard people were working too.
Yeah.
That was very impressive to me. I mean, I have to say, I took great inspiration from Laura Ritchie and how hard she worked at the Carrick. I remember, months would go by and she wouldn't take any days off. Like, this is a very old Carrick story, and I don't know how many people even know it, but I think it was maybe during their third year. Oh, and I'm going to blank on the person's name who pulled the prank. But the Carrick would let you like do all the setup yourself. Like you had to stage it yourself. If you're Gabe, and you're doing your art show, you have to bang the nails into the wall.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. So this fella who lived next door to me and Mark Kaufman, who was also an artist, had pitched, and that was back before they had a big committee reviewing what all the exhibitions were going to be, and before it was super duper competitive. And he kind of had this like really secretive project, and he wasn't going to tell Laura about exactly how he was going to stage it. And he was an artist. He built beautiful frames and stuff. And the whole project was, when the Carrick finally gave him the keys, he locked it and told Laura to take like the next like 5 days off or something. And like, I think she kind of freaked out a little bit, but it was also just emblematic of this guy being like, you never take any time off. He had gone to grad school with her, undergrad with her at Carolina for art. And that's how hard she was working. She had just gone years where it seemed like she took no days off. And I feel like, when Aurelie and Leon went from bike coffee, they founded Cocoa Cinnamon on a bike, to where they are now and how hard they worked. And when I would go to those Dirty Durham meetings, and you would see Patrick and a cast of 5 or 6 other people put together a great party illegal and a summer music festival, and you'd be like, where's the team of... No, they're doing all the sound, they're figuring out the lighting, they're raising the money. And I think just seeing how hard everybody was working was fucking great. It was really inspiring as a writer.
Yeah, and that really speaks to, I think, what separates Durham. I haven't done a whole ton of traveling in my young life, but from the stories that I've heard from folks and from people like that have lived elsewhere and then moved to Durham and can, see this canvas, this blank canvas for them to really paint their masterpiece on. And there was a camaraderie too. There was something that Katie talked about as well. She, the analogy she used was like all of us being in grad school together at the same time. There was this real drive to be successful, but then also a real drive to see other people be successful. And,
totally true.
We really benefited, the early days that I started working with Gabe, where there was there was layering to the collaboration that everyone was doing. So we do a show, a release show at Mercury Studio, and Katie would let us use the space, and then we'd set up shop there. And
you'd bring in Raj Bunyang to do like screening, right. And like, Gabe would talk the PBR rep into giving us free beer, and it would just be like, yeah, it was collaborative over competitive.
Yeah, and it really helped build this density for the scene to take another's, go up a level. And it wasn't eventually it wasn't just artists supporting artists. We all started to get a fan base outside of that, and were able to grow in different ways. So I really appreciate that aspect of it. And I wonder, and I would love to spend some time thinking about this, both from a media standpoint, but then also just from a cultural standpoint in Durham. I wonder if that can continue given the landscape that exists now. There are certainly more resources than there used to be in downtown Durham. Obviously, it looks a lot different than when we were first sort of covering everything. So there's more spaces, maybe there's more money in the environment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there are more spaces for weird art shows, or there's more money for upstart clothing companies or jazz festivals or art galleries or whatever it may be. So and the same can be said for media as well. There were hundreds of layoffs last week with Vice and BuzzFeed and some of these other big major publications. And we all know that for years, if not decades, local media, newspapers have been losing their foothold in the community. And so I just wonder about, we talk a lot about sort of grassroots movements in this country, but I wonder if it's still possible in Durham to have sort of grassroots movement that has any kind of momentum.
Yeah, it's very tough for me to say yes. I mean, I think if people go to the Clarion Content website right now, they'll see we're as inactive as we've been in, years, maybe since the beginning. And very much that's financial. We moved to a model at some point, probably 5, 6, 7 years ago now, where we started paying all first the photographers and then all the writers and then, for podcasting. And we were trying to pay everybody and all of our content creators. And we wanted to still stick with that, but we could not, we're no different than anybody else. We have not figured out the answer for local media. I had hoped that we could get to almost like a Patreon style model where we had sustainers like the way the CARE Act did, zero commission and sustainers. Here will provide you the news. And I think in some ways we push the other newsmakers in town to do a better job of covering Durham. And in some ways, Durham just did so well, it was impossible to ignore. But yeah, we did not find a solution to the revenue problem. And in some ways, the Clarion content may never be as active as it once was. I've been writing for Durham Magazine, and I see what they're doing, and I think Amanda McLaren, their editor, does an excellent job covering culture. Now, it's tricky. They can't do the police blotter and, do investigative or political reporting. And the Indy has a very complicated situation of its own because they have to cover Raleigh, and they have to cover Chapel Hill, and they have to cover Hillsborough. So I don't know. I mean, it is a complicated time for local media. And if you are a breakout artist right now, a young hip hop artist, I don't know who's covering you. And I don't know who's writing about the new shows at the Carrack right now. And I do know that it's been very hard. The Clarion Content's lost a lot of money over the years paying people to cover these things. And it's been a tremendous passion project. But at some point also, absent a real financial model, it's very difficult.
Yeah, and really, I wonder what that does for the community at large to not have that voice on the ground level. The analogy that I've heard you often use is, if the Indy is the New York Times, then the Clarion Content is the Village Voice for Durham. And, without that voice to speak to these grassroots movements, political culture, or whatever, then they often just get lost in the chaos of everything that's happening. And
it's sad too, because there's so many great things happening. I am actually sitting on a couple of really cool pieces about events that happened at Durham Fruit, things that happened during the Click Photography Festival. I've got an article on the Durham Public Schools Foundation, which I know you're very familiar with, that I'd love to publish. And in all cases, there's a certain amount of pressure because I know as soon as I publish that, we got to cut a check to the person who wrote it. And while I want to do that, we don't get in enough in Patreon sustainer contributions a month to cover the cost of paying for several articles.
Yeah, and do you think that is an attention problem to some degree where people
Definitely.
are just, it's hard for them to conceive donating to any one institution because they know that they can get it for free somewhere else, or they can follow somebody for free on Instagram that, they can get, even if it's 60% of that same information, then, it's like, well, I'm already on Instagram.
Or even it's just a cool photo about that information.
Right.
Like I love some of what Durham's public institutions, like I think it's the Durham Convention and Visitors Bureau has a really great Instagram account. Mm-hmm. Discover Durham, is that them? Yeah. I mean, the photographer who does that does a great job and takes really cool pictures. And, I think that there's a psychology that media could or should be free in America. I mean, who do you know pays 99 cents a month for the New York Times? Or the LA Times, or who still subscribes to the New Yorker or the Economist. And these people are doing great work, great, important journalism. And instead, we've been, I think, psychologized by network TV to think that you can just flip on the television and TV is free. And what we've learned, especially in light of the last presidential election, is actually that the cost is in advertising. And the cost of advertising is in the decay to our society by having advertising, because advertising is essentially paid lying.
Yeah. Well, and even if it's not, advertising in the sense that it's, a spot, like a TV ad spot or, 6x8 in the newspaper, there is some corporate institution with an ulterior motive that is contributing financially to the, to the output of the work of that journalistic institution, and so it's compromised. And
Inevitable.
you know, our mutual friend Jeremy Rist would be very pleased to hear you say all this about sort of the you know, what corporate money can do to the voice of journalism. I think you're absolutely right that because we've been conditioned to think that journalism and media is free, that there's something out there that I can get for free, that it doesn't have value. And we really have to sort of recondition ourselves to understand that, you know, you pay for the quality that you get, and if you get it for free, it's probably not great quality.
Or someone was exploited to make it free. And I'm hopeful about the Patreon model, but just to talk about that whole idea of being exploited to make it for free, think of like graphic design contests. Like, I know you're up on this kind of thing. I know Monica Byrne and I think Rebecca Miel, if I'm saying her name right, are giving the city of Durham a bunch of hard time about this. I've seen it over the ABCD listserv, where multiple times the city has sponsored graphic design contests, which essentially require the person doing the submission to a quote unquote contest to do all the work that would be required for the actual project itself. And then we're only going to pick one out of every 100 or 200 people who submitted it and pay that one person. And everyone else's work, they had to do it for free. They got nothing. And I think, you know, there's something in this idea of racing to the cheapest, racing to the bottom, that is inherently poisonous to our culture. And we have to remember, like you said, that quality work should be paid for. And maybe the Patreon model does help us and we can find a way around it. But it's tough times in journalism and tough times in art and tough times in the music industry. And it seems like that's a few too many things to have tough times for it to be a coincidence.
Yeah, and they all sort of center around art, or just
creative
art,
product.
Yeah, exactly. It's you know, there's people don't really think about journalism and media as a good in the way that they think about like going to the grocery store and buying something, or buying a car, or you know, a new computer or whatever, a new iPhone, whatever it might
Try
be.
telling a car salesman, well, I'll pay for that with exposure. You give me the brand new Mercedes, I'll drive it around for free. Other people will buy Mercedes. Exposure. That's what they try and sell journalists and photographers. Write for the Huffington Post. We're not going to pay you anything, but people will see your byline, and that'll probably get you jobs where you make some money.
Or it'll get you Twitter and Instagram followers, and those will somehow
You can certainly
get you...
eat your Twitter follower.
Right.
No, you can't actually buy groceries with Twitter followers.
Maybe one
Not
day.
that we don't love Twitter.
Yeah.
And I don't actually want to turn my Twitter feed, though, you know, on a side conversation, into an advertisement. I don't want to sell my tweets as like, all right, well, you give me enough money and I'll say that your art show was awesome and people should buy it. Like, that's the whole, I like Durham because it is no bullshit. I don't want to get into that kind of fronting. I don't want the distinction between advertising and journalism to collapse even further.
When it's that same, you know, corporate sort of meddling that we talked about before, just in a different way with influencers on social media. I've been thinking a lot about this, and you know, trying to find the balance between being, you know, promoting your work because you think it's good work, but not selling yourself and sort of becoming a human billboard to accomplish that goal. And so
it's so hard.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, I feel especially for musicians and visual artists, like, who does write about your show or your new album or your new mixtape or, you know, your visual show, your art show, your sculpture? And without anyone writing about it, how do you spread the word without sounding like a shill?
Well, and two, you know, because money is tight and a lot of it's driven by clicks and views and things like that, you know, it can distort what you actually say about the things too. You know, you're thinking about the most viral ability of the content you're creating. And so you may make certain decisions about the content you're making based on that, and not making something purely, whether it's the art you're creating or as a writer, the critique that you're making about the art, or our politicians or whatever it is that you might be doing. There is
Certainly our politicians change their speech based on what they think campaign contributions will be and how they think it'll play.
and the media responds as
Absolutely.
well. The headlines that they write and the way that they choose to frame conversations, and it's really, really complicated. I certainly don't have an answer, and
Well, I
it
think
feels like
awareness
no one does, but
is a lot. Yeah, no one.
yeah.
I don't think anyone necessarily does, but awareness is what's super important. The further we stick our head in the sand and say that money isn't influencing the outcome, that capitalism isn't influencing the outcomes, the worse off we are. The more we expose the methodologies of how these things happen and the processes of how these things happen, then the more opportunity we have to resist. And it's not new. I mean, the old joke about musical songs on the radio used to be about how they have to cut it down to 305. You can't have radio airplay. Like nobody would play Bohemian Rhapsody or, Stairway to Heaven. It was too long. So this is not a new problem that the creative community has been shaped by the dollar. But I think perhaps globalism, perhaps the internet, international capital has made it even worse by driving the price down. Those graphic design contests, what if you're competing against someone in China, who is paying rent, in Western China, and you're trying to pay rent not even in Los Angeles, but in Durham?
Yeah. That's opening.
Yeah,
a whole
it's
nother
weighty.
can
It's a
of-
Pandora's box, but I do think awareness of it in media and that's the root. That's the start. Kids today are aware of all kinds of things that we had no sense of the connection.
What are you hoping for from Durham in the next 5 to 10 years, based on the trajectory that you see it on now? Not only what are you hoping for, but we do have a show with Steve Schul, the current mayor of Durham.
Love that guy.
He's a very very nice man and very,
Leads with his heart.
Yeah.
Heart in all the time. What more could you ask for from your politician?
So I think that, and that's true throughout, the city council, I would say.
True.
And so I do think that there is leadership throughout Durham that have good intentions, but obviously there are forces at play within Durham and then also outside of Durham that can dictate a lot of where Durham goes. But short of sort of waving a magic wand and getting your wish, what would you hope to see from Durham as a community, going forward in the next few years?
Well, you can't wave the magic wand. You're certainly right about that. Steve, the mayor, is always telling us about the limits of his power based on the North Carolina legislature and also based on the city manager. So I think it's facetious to wait around for politicians to solve the problems for us. And I think Durham has issues. I mean, I love what the Durham Public Schools Foundation is doing. I think for a very long time, when people have knocked Durham and knocked our public schools, it's been one of the few things where what can we say? We've had a lot of great products of our public schools and a lot of great students, but we've also failed a lot of students. We've had classrooms that have too many kids and that are dangerous, and we've had a high school suspension to prison pipeline and the kind of problems lots of big cities suffer. So I think one of the things I would really like to see is true equality in the Durham public schools and a real consciousness of send your kid to public school, because we all fucking know that plenty of rich people in Durham are like, well, the public schools suck, but my kid goes to Durham Academy, so you don't have to worry about it. Or my kid goes to Carolina Friends, or my kid goes to, I don't know, one of those, schools out in Raleigh or Cary or whatever.
Or one of the charter schools, even.
Right. Yeah. So, and that's not an attack on those schools. Durham Academy is a great school and they're doing great things. And, Carolina Friends, I love the psychology behind the Quaker school, but public schools is part of how we're all in it together. And I think you said earlier, and I certainly agree, that collaborative over competitive thing was one of the things that really made Durham special, that really made Durham different. Culturally, creatively, it was something that attracted people to us. And I think the schools are a great place to start. I think, there's a lot of other issues. There's serious gun gang drug violence problems in Durham right now. And nobody wants to talk about it, least of all the city manager and the police chief. But I think, as you and I have talked about in the past, those are not a silo. Those are related to school problems. Those are related nutritional problems and things like, food deserts and hope for jobs. And it's a bucket of things that we can't just say, well, I hope Steve Schul and Jillian Johnson and Charlie Reese just all solve this for us. Our city council and our mayor are individuals like us. So I think models like the Durham Public Schools Foundation, ways for us to collectively contribute, people who are thinking about the larger psychology. I've been incredibly impressed with American Underground over the last 3, 4, 5 years, thinking about how can they be a minority-friendly startup hub? How can they have more women in leadership? How can they work with, their parent, Capital Broadcasting, to do things that are more inclusive? And I think there are lots of people whose hearts are in the right place in Durham. So I hope that we can lead with our hearts and have that collaborative psychology and not be frustrated by the fact that there is a huge influx of money and we're really popular and we're suddenly the belle of the ball. I think what would be disastrous is for us to build a bunch of really fancy things that aren't used by a large segment of our population and to kind of ignore that segment of the population. Shoulder shrug, no other city in America can solve it. So how are we different than Baltimore, Philadelphia, Detroit? Too bad, those people must just suck. No, that's ridiculous, untrue, and a harm to ourselves and a harm to our society in the long run. So there was a point close to that 2010, 11, 12 era where I thought maybe Durham would be a model for larger America of collaboration and cooperation, of harmony and justice. And I don't know, I'm hopeful, but what do the Fugees say? Money breaks groups up like the 5 Heartbeats. I feel like
it makes me want to really revisit that album today. Might have to add that to the old Spotify queue.
Nice.
After the recording of the show. Before I let you go, I would love for you to share one lesson or one piece of advice that or tidbit of knowledge that you've gained over your time working with the Clarion content, being here in Durham, and just for the aspiring storytellers and journalists and really just go-getters out there. What's something that you could pass along to them?
I would say if you're not prepared to serve, you're not prepared to lead. And I think it's really important. Laura and Richie and the Carrack, they moved the chairs around. They filled the water glasses. They found somebody to donate the food. You and I, when we were doing and Heather Cook, when we were doing the Mayor Up forums and getting mayoral candidates to speak, we didn't have a staff putting out chairs for us. We put out the chairs. I have been to Commercial Light and Sound, shout out on Guest Road, to rent microphones and lights so many times over the years for so many projects. And I think that it's really important to remember that it's okay to be a grunt and that you need to be a grunt. And it's not just humping around the idea of I'm just going to write constantly. And I do like the idea. If you're a writer, if you're a creator, dwell in your work. I believe in that Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours, but also don't be like, who's going to set up the chairs? Who's going to sweep the floor? How's this going to happen? Sometimes you are the guy who sets up the chairs and sweeps the floor and makes it all happen. And the reward is in the outcome of the event. The way the Dirty Durham people handled sound and lighting, the way the Pinhook has done that for years. I mean, I know Motorco similarly is a family business in a lot of ways. And who mops the floor at the end of the night at Motorco? There's not some magical guest service that comes in from out of town to do it. That's somebody and probably someone who you think of as a great artist or a creator or see in another vein. So if you're not prepared to serve, you're not prepared to lead. And I think that there's a level at which that starts out very personally. My old life coach used to say, what Bonnie Cohen, who I love dearly and miss dearly, used to say, who also wrote for the Clarion content, a great advice column for a long time, that an ashram and an army both start their day by making their bed. And it's that very simple idea of service and bringing order to your own personal space. And what could be more different than a pacifist monk and a conquering army? Yet it's be prepared to serve. Bring that order to your personal space so that you can have clarity and room to have those higher level thoughts and those higher level discussions. And I think it's a lesson I've learned the hard way too, in some ways, where I did not figure out enough of the basics of the Clarion content first. I just tried to jump in and be like, look at this cool art show and look at this great band and let's write about this and that. And, I was doing all the candy parts and not enough eating the veggies and thinking about the rest of my diet. And I think that's part of why it's been financially difficult. So be prepared to serve.
Thank you so much. That's a great philosophy to leave this conversation on. Aaron, I really appreciate you taking the time to be on the show. Again, it's been a long time coming, and I hope we get to do it again. There's so many things that we didn't cover that I would love to, and we'll certainly find their way into other content that we end up working on together, whether it be this show or the town hall or other pieces on Clarion content or more mayoral forums in the future. So thanks again for being on the show and for all that you do for the community with the Clarion content and otherwise. This has been episode 7.
Thank you, Justin.
Oh, of course. Episode 7 of the Buddy Ruski Show. Again, you can always find this on the website, buddyruski.com. You can now find it on anywhere that you stream podcasts, so Spotify, Apple Music, all that good stuff. You can also check out the Patreon page, patreon.com/BuddyRuski. These go up on that site as well. And if you would like to become a sustainer of this show or the Clarion content, you should do that as well. Because
Media needs your support.
Exactly.
Media needs your support. Exactly. Newsflash.
You could put that on repeat to end this show.
Media needs your support.
Thanks again, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you next time. Peace.